In hindsight, it was a really stupid idea. Carl thought that maybe his son just needed closure, which was very out of character for his infamously domineering parenting style. But then again, as can be evidenced by this entire cluster mess, his patience did extend much further than your average parent. Maybe he had gone soft in his old age. That was at least an excuse that his wife Sherry couldn't claim. She had mollycoddled her sweet Miah from the moment the doctor confirmed that he was inside her. Now, here he was, 50 years old, no woman, no friends, a very low paying job, and not much else. And as of 3:45 p.m., he was locked in his old room in their house with zero intention of vacating any time soon. What happened was that after virtually a full lifetime of providing their beloved son with shelter, his crib used to occupy that room for God's sake. Carl and Sherry came to the very hard conclusion that they needed to kill the boy and let the middle-aged man live. So after another few months of delaying, then a few weeks of trying to casually suggest that he maybe start getting his shit together and pack the hell up, they scheduled a dinner with their son and broke the news as directly as they could. There were tears, try as Miah and his mother did to hold them back. There were also lots of pats on the back and plenty of reassurance from his father that this was the best thing for him and that he would surely land on his feet. He claimed that he would be thanking them in no time, clearly ignorant as to how foolish that phrase sounds during traumatic times like these. Naturally, Miah wrote it off as a bald-faced lie and asked to be excused, despite there being almost 70% of his Salisbury steak left on his plate, and an untouched, and still warm from the initial baking, homemade apple pie waiting in the oven. Miah was not stupid. In fact, he was what some like to call too smart for his own good. He knew the free ride he had, and he was full aware of the perks he possessed in his perpetual state of adolescence. He paid no rent, was served at minimum one hot meal per day, had access to a full array of cable channels and high-speed internet, and he barely did any chores. Why would he ever want to leave? With his remedial maturity level in mind, one might readily understand how he was naturally focused on what he had with this arrangement and was forgetting all that he was giving up. Living at home made him never need to advance in his career, if you call working behind a register at Panera a career. And it made it obviously clear that most, if not all women, especially at his age level, would classify that particular living situation as an immediate deal breaker. So he never needed to want anything, because he convinced himself he could never have it. Pretty soon his family picked up on his actions as predicated by this mindset, and before anyone realized, they dropped all expectations of him too. No confidence, no motivation, no wonder. The weeks came and passed, and Miah eventually found a friend at his place of work that would allow him to occupy a room for a fair rate. The semi-irony of his new residence being within that friend's parents' home was lost on everyone, although it could have been that maybe at this point his parents just didn't care as long as he was out of their space. Someone else's problem, I guess. He moved his possessions over the course of those last few weekends, and on the first of the following month, he surrendered his key. The first few weeks flew by, and both parents weren't so much hurt but concerned that he had not reached out to them even once. Sherry decided to send a short text just to get an idea of how he was doing, but it was ignored for nearly 2 days before Miah responded a court indication of his generic contentment. She left it at that and instead tried to turn her attention toward how nice her home was, with just her husband and herself occupying it. They had married and then moved in when she was only 20. She became pregnant a few months later, then out came Miah. Thus, this was an entirely new world to her. She had been a full-service mother for longer than most capital murderers had spent behind bars, and she had never really known this house without Miah in it. It would take some getting used to. It wasn't until about a full month away from home that he reached out. To his dad, that is. He sent him a text saying that he needed to download a certain game to his system, and the internet was so taxed at his current place that it would take all day, whereas it would only take an hour tops at his former residence. He then politely inquired if it would be possible to download that data at his parents' house. Now, Sherry and Carl had decided together that just to make sure the break was as clean as possible, they would not allow Miah back into the home for any circumstances, for at least 6 months. This took a few meetings to clarify and solidify, but the decision had been made. This information was not necessarily relayed to Miah, at least not explicitly, and for a variety of reasons, but as he was now challenging the ruling, he would have to be told. Carl did what Miah hated and had repeatedly requested that he didn't do, which was call him in response to a text. Carl was forced to leave a message explaining the terms. He was thus punished by receiving neither a call back nor a text signifying that he understood the statute. What happened next was where the cracks started to show, as they say. To keep it short and simple, Sherry and Carl were not big entertainers, despite their lovely home. Whether this was a deep-seated shame of their overgrown man-child son, who always, and now ironically, locked himself in his room when any stranger came over, or because they just valued their own intimacy, who's to say? Anyway, there was one major exception when it came to their penchant for limiting hordes of guests into their home, and that was Christmas. Every year, they hosted a get-together exactly 2 Saturdays before the birth of Christ, and they invited all of their family, which meant mostly Sherry, since Carl only had one brother, Big Tom, and he almost never attended. Well, it was now officially 3 Saturdays before the birth, and the issue had arisen if Miah should be allowed to attend. Not only was this Miah's favorite event, it was one of the only times where he actually came out of his room to join. That is not to say he rarely interacts with his own family. It's to say he never does, outside of the Christmas party. For whatever reason, this is the one time a year that Miah places his dust cover over his gaming PC and spends the entire evening with his beloved aunts, uncles, and cousins. In a sort of very sad way, his family all looked forward to the limited time with their Miah, and if everyone was being honest, it was one of the biggest draws that made it the can't-miss event that it was. The rule clearly stated that Miah was not under any circumstance to be allowed into the home for almost 4 more full months. So, unfortunately, their hands were tied, and this by all means would be the maiden voyage of the Miah-less Davidson Christmas party. Now, you may be wondering at this point as to why this rule was made and why it had to be so explicitly enforced. Well, there were a few reasons. First of all, the cleanliness of the break was paramount. Just like when one breaks up with a lover, distance is critical, in the beginning at least. It gives a false hope and just a sloppy closure to keep seeing each other as friends. It just never works that way. It could maybe transmutate to that after a few months or so of distance, so as to reinforce the fact that the level of intimacy had shifted, but no wise man or woman is having lunch with long-term ex 2 months after a breakup. Carl added a second comparison in describing the fear to Sherry as being akin to when a recovering alcoholic was brought to a bar by his friends, and just by environment alone, he or she relapses and the cycle starts over much worse than before. Why even walk into a bar in the first place? And what kind of friends would do that to the recovering alcoholic? Certainly ones that hardly deserve that word describing their relationship to him or her. Sherry personally did not believe it would get this bad, but she did agree with the basis of these points, and thus the rule was made. And now, they were meeting with its first true test. After all, a rule is only as strong as the threats it overcomes, and the problems it avoids. There was another thing, too. It was mostly his father's concern, and he claimed he feared this precisely because he knew his son so well. But he was essentially afraid that he would use the crowd of sympathetic loved ones and the effervescent holiday cheer to make a scene and eventually a play to be reinstated as a tenant. It was very unfair for Sherry and Carl to factor in outside opinions when acting for the well-being of their only son, but they cared a great deal about what their family thought of them. And as odd as it might sound, they enjoyed the thought that they were praised for caring for their son at the same time they were ashamed that they were judged for coddling him into a state where he was unable to grow up. Carl really did know his son well, and he was not about to underestimate Miah's penchant for theater and for evoking pity from the guests and shame from his parents, which could all amalgamate to create a new and more permanent pathway toward reinstating his tenancy. Well, when it came down to it, they learned very well that the rule in its full 6-month duration was in fact a very savvy one indeed, for nearly all of their previously discussed reasoning. Unfortunately, the way they realized this was when Miah entered the home in very high spirits, worked the room like a young Sinatra, made everyone feel very welcomed and comfortable before asking to use the facilities, and then locking himself in his old bedroom.